The golden statue stood against the horizon, a jagged silhouette cutting into the sky above the plains of Dura. It was massive, a monument to a single will, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch for miles. King Nebuchadnezzar sat upon his throne, his gaze sweeping over the thousands gathered in the valley below. The air was thick, stagnant, and heavy with the smell of dry earth. A trumpet blast shattered the silence, a sharp metallic scream that echoed off the surrounding hills and vibrated in the chests of everyone present. The command followed, carried by heralds across the expanse. Bow or burn. There was no room for hesitation. The sound of thousands of bodies hitting the dust happened in a single synchronized wave, a dull thud that rippled through the valley. The king remained motionless on his throne, his eyes tracking the sea of bent heads and lowered spines. The dust began to settle, but the silence remained unbroken. Thousands of heads were pressed into the grit, a sea of bowed spines and hidden faces. Yet, in the center of the vast expanse, the geometry of the scene was wrong. 3 figures remained upright. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood like stone pillars against a rushing tide. They did not shift their weight. They did not look down. They stood with their heads held level, their presence a sharp, vertical interruption in a landscape of total submission. Around them, the crowd seemed to shrink away, creating a circle of empty space that highlighted their isolation. The wind picked up, swirling dust around their feet, but they did not flinch. The king's gaze, previously scanning the horizon with detached authority, slowed. It caught on the 3 men. He leaned forward, his hands tightening on the armrests of his throne. The rhythm of the valley had been shattered. Where there was once a singular, crushing weight of obedience, there was now a focal point of resistance. The guards near the base of the statue shifted, their hands moving to their weapons as they realized the king's attention had locked onto the center of the crowd. The guards moved in a tight formation, their boots kicking up clouds of grit as they crossed the open space. They reached the 3 men and forced them forward, hands gripping shoulders with enough pressure to bruise. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were shoved toward the base of the throne, their feet dragging through the dry earth. The king leaned over the edge of his seat, his face darkening until the veins in his neck stood out. He waited, letting the silence stretch. He hissed, his voice a low, jagged sound that carried across the platform. "Is it true? You defy my decree?" Shadrach stepped into the small space left by the guards. He did not look at the ground. He looked directly at the king. "We do not need to defend ourselves," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Our God is able to save us, but even if he does not, we will not bow." He pointed a shaking finger at the furnace, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Heat the furnace 7 times hotter," he roared. The command hit the furnace like a physical blow. The structure groaned, the metal plates vibrating as the internal fires surged. Within seconds, the orange glow deepened into a violent, blinding white. The air around the furnace began to shimmer and warp, creating a distortion that made the ground appear to ripple like water. The heat was no longer just a temperature. It was a physical weight. The soldiers tasked with the execution stepped forward, but the intensity was absolute. They did not even reach the threshold. As they approached the opening, the air itself became a wall of fire. The first guard stumbled, his skin blistering instantly, and he collapsed. The second guard turned to run, but the heat caught him, his movement slowing as if he were wading through liquid lead. He fell. The furnace roared, a hungry, living beast of light that consumed everything. The heat was so intense that the sand began to fuse into glass. It was a furnace of impossible proportions, a gateway of pure energy. The crowd backed away, shielding their faces from the glare. The king gestured, his eyes fixed on the white-hot center of the furnace. The remaining guards, faces tight with terror, grabbed the 3 men from behind. They used long, iron-tipped poles to keep their distance, shoving Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego toward the furnace mouth. The men moved forward, their feet sliding through the loose sand. They did not struggle, and they did not look back. As they reached the threshold, the heat hit them like a physical wall, forcing their heads to turn away. The guards gave one final, desperate push. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stumbled forward, crossing the line where the air turned to liquid fire. They fell into the heart of the inferno. The impact was silent, swallowed instantly by the roaring furnace. A massive plume of white light erupted from the opening, casting long, distorted shadows. The crowd gasped in unison, a sharp intake of breath that cut through the roar of the fire. Thousands of hands went up to shield eyes from the blinding glare. The three men were gone, lost within the swirling, hungry light. The heat intensified, radiating outward in waves that made the ground tremble. The king sat motionless, his gaze locked on the white-hot center of the furnace. He expected only ash. He expected only the silence of death. But the fire did not behave as fire should. It swirled in patterns that defied the wind. Nebuchadnezzar leaned forward, his hands gripping the stone armrests of his throne until his knuckles turned pale. He squinted, shielding his eyes from the glare, and his breath hitched in his throat. He stood up so quickly that his chair scraped harshly against the stone floor. His jaw dropped. He pointed a trembling finger toward the heart of the inferno. "Did we not throw 3 men into the fire?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The guards scrambled to look, their faces draining of color. The king did not wait for an answer. He saw them. 4 figures were moving through the flames. They walked with a steady, deliberate pace, their steps unhurried and calm. The 4th figure moved with a grace that made the surrounding fire seem to bow away. The execution chamber had become a sanctuary. The king stared, unable to look away, as the impossible unfolded before his eyes. The fire was no longer a tomb. It was a place of peace. The king stood at the edge of the platform, his voice booming across the plains. "Come out!" he shouted, his command echoing into the furnace. The 4 figures turned. They walked toward the furnace door, the heat parting before them like a curtain. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped onto the dry earth of the valley. The air around them was cool, a sharp contrast to the furnace that still roared behind them. The king rushed forward, his eyes searching for any sign of the trial. He looked at their faces, their hands, their skin. There was no scent of smoke. Not a single hair was singed. Not a mark of the fire remained. They stood before the thousands, breathing easily, their movements steady and unhurried. The crowd watched, frozen in place. The silence that followed was heavy, a terrified, reverent stillness that gripped the entire valley. The fire, meant to be their tomb, had become their sanctuary. The gods dropped their spears, the clatter ringing out across the plains. No one moved, no one spoke. The impossible had been witnessed. The valley of Dura is long gone, but the furnace remains. It does not always burn with orange light or roar with heat. Sometimes, it takes the shape of a mounting debt that keeps you awake at night. Sometimes, it is the weight of a fear that settles in your chest, making every breath feel like a labor. You may be standing in the middle of a situation that feels like an inevitable end. The walls of your own life might feel as though they are closing in, pressing against your resolve, testing the limits of what you can carry. But look closer at the heat. What you perceive as a force meant to consume you is often the very thing that tempers your character. A crucible does not destroy the metal. It burns away the dross, leaving behind something refined and hardened. Your current struggle is not an accident of circumstance. It is a space where your strength is being forged, layer by layer, under pressure that would break a lesser spirit. You are not standing in the fire because you failed. You are standing there because you are being prepared for a purpose that requires a different kind of endurance. The heat is intense, but it is not the end of your story. If you are currently standing in the center of your own fire, look again. The heat that surrounds you is not a sign of abandonment.